for an exciting conversation that we're going to have that hope will inform us, also will encourage us as we think about how we can continue to be involved in the great work of encouraging and helping others in the midst of not only COVID-19, but also impacting our city. My name is Nathan Payne, and I serve as a pastor at Park Community Church located here in the city of Chicago. Many of you might be watching who are part of our church, so grateful that you're with us. And then we also know there's folks who are watching, perhaps you are a healthcare provider, and maybe you're not connected to either healthcare or Park, but you just love our city and have a care for people. Well, so glad that you are here with us tonight. And I just want to just get a quick shout out to those of you all who are watching all over the city. If you would be so kind, just right now as you're joining us, go ahead and just make a comment where you're watching from, what part of the city or what part of the world you're in. And we would love to hear where you are joining us from. This is going to be an interactive time through the time that we're on tonight, which means that we are going to have opportunity for you to be asking questions, as well as for you to really just be engaged in the conversation with us. And so just in the chat, go ahead and let us know where you are going to be watching from or where you're watching from. We'd love to hear where you are joining us. Well, I've had the privilege to serve as a pastor here at Park, but one of the reasons I'm excited about tonight's conversation is while I've been a pastor for about 7 years, I spent 14 years prior to that here working as a registered nurse, and a number of those years was at Rush University Hospital Center, which is now just Rush Hospital. And it has been a joy for me to be able to be part of the conversation tonight. We're going to be joined by two very special guests this evening, and I'd love to introduce them in a moment. Just want to say a thank you to our sponsors tonight for tonight's conversation. Renew Chicago, Chicago Delivers, and Together Chicago, also Resource Global, and then lastly, the Chicago Sunday Evening Club. Just want to thank each of those organizations and the great work that they're doing as they have sponsored us for tonight. And so we're looking forward to tonight's conversation. If you're just joining us, we're having a conversation on the death gap, and wow, what a time for us to be having a conversation like this. So I want to introduce our guest for us tonight who will be joining us in this conversation. Our first guest is Spencer Jacob. Spencer Jacob is one of the elders here at Park Community Church at our South Loop location. He is also the founder of Circulation, which is a medical fellowship of followers of Jesus who are in either healthcare providers or advocates. And we'd love to hear more about that as Spencer will share more about Circulation in just a moment. But also Spencer began his career as a critical care respiratory therapist and pursued his graduate education and began working in cardiothoracic surgery and lung transplantation. And now he is working as an advanced practice provider in orthopedic surgery and sports medicine. And he really does a focus currently on underserved populations. And I would love for him to share a little bit more about that. And he's currently working in neighborhoods in Chicago, Little Village, and Austin, and also has been engaged with going to folks across the globe to use his skill set. So looking forward to hear more from Spencer in just a moment. Spencer, it's great to have you tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Our second guest is Dr. David Ansell. He is Michael E. Kelly Presidential Professor of Internal Medicine and Senior Vice President, Associate Provost for Community Health Equity at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. He's a 78 graduate of SUNY Upstate Medical College and did his medical training at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, right here in our backyard. Spent 13 years there as the general internal medicine. there at Cook County, and from 1995 to 2005, he was chairman of internal medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital right here in Chicago. He joined Rush University Medical Center as its inaugural chief medical officer in 2005, and a position he held in until 2015. And much of his research and advocacy has been focused on eliminating health inequalities. And in 2011, particularly, he published a memoir of his times at County Hospital called County, Life, Death, and Politics at Chicago's Public Hospital. And his latest book that he just published in 2017 is called The Death Gap, How Inequality Kills. And we're excited to have you with us tonight, Dr. Ansell. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as we think about this conversation we're going to have tonight, I just love for Sensor just to share a little bit, tell us a little bit about circulation. And then why are you interested in this conversation tonight, Sensor?
Thanks, Nathan. And Dr. Ansell, I'm so grateful that we have the opportunity to dive into this topic tonight. For those of you who don't know, circulation is a medical fellowship that basically is comprised of over 200 multidisciplinary providers across the city of Chicago. The focus and foundation of the fellowship is really to build their foundation in Jesus Christ, deepening relationships and accountability within the medical community, and serving the Lord through medicine throughout Chicago and across all nations. The topic of healthcare disparities is something that's really near and dear to my heart and has shaped my drive to provide medicine and pursue this career. And to be completely honest, Dr. Ansell, your work and research in this area has really shaped a drive with my organization, specifically Genesis Orthopedics and Sports Medicine, and has really allowed us to have a heart to pursue the unreached and underserved neighborhoods of Chicago. And so my work right now is really focused on Austin and Little Village and those areas that you talk about in the Death Gap. And so for those of you who have not read the book, I highly, highly recommend this book as a necessity of something we should read to really understand what is going on in our city. And for those of you who haven't read the book, Dr. Ansell, to kind of begin, can you explain what exactly the Death Gap is?
I hope everyone can hear me. My wireless is sometimes goes unwired, or maybe that's my brain that goes unwired. But so I've been a doctor on the west side of Chicago for 41 years. And my observation as a white middle-class man who came from upstate New York and landed in Chicago over these years through the eyes of my patients and their families was that there was something going on that wasn't named, that was causing ill health and premature mortality in my families and their patients. And really, it was really hard to put a name on it. And, I spent 17 years at Cook County and then a decade at Mount Sinai, and then got to Rush as the inaugural chief medical officer. And these hospitals were either across the street from each other or literally down the street from each other. And there was something about the neighborhoods themselves, something going on in the neighborhoods that seemed to impart a burden of premature illness and death on patients, not just of mine, but my colleagues as well, that seemed to be unexplained by what I learned in medical school. In medical school, we learned that there are biological causes of death, or there are behavioral causes of death. I disappeared. Am I back? Do you hear me? Oh, there I am. I just popped back. that there are causes of death that are caused by people's beliefs, behaviors, and biology. I call them the 3 Bs. But it seemed to be something else was going on. And I came to the conclusion that inequality itself was a cause of disease. That's things like unnamed things, like structural racism, like concentrated poverty, uh, like a poor, poor housing, inadequate food, were too, in part causing premature mortality. And that if you look at today, the neighborhoods in Chicago, and you look at the Loop or the near north of Chicago, in some subsets of those neighborhoods, you can live to be 90 years old, the life expectancy in some parts of the Loop or the near north. And yet, if you go 7 stops down the Blue Line, you to Garfield Park, and in some neighborhoods, small census tracts, you live to under 65 years old. There's actually 25 to 30-year life expectancy gap in Chicago. And if you look at the difference between and literally, 3 stops past Rush, and life expectancy plummets in Garfield Park to under 68 years old. 60, and imagine what that means. You hardly collect Medicare or Social Security. And I call these gaps death gaps. They're opportunity gaps, because it means that I'm going to be 68, and I get to be here with my grandkids, and hopefully I'm here for a few more years. But imagine that, that people are dying younger, and what that means. And of course, then people immediately think of Garfield Park or Englewood, and they think of it being gun violence as being the cause of death. And certainly, it's certainly violence is a problem in these neighborhoods, and homicide. I don't want to minimize the problem of it, but and I usually give a talk, and I give the fact that a 16-year-old Black teenage young man has a little bit more than a 50% chance of living to the age of 65 in Garfield Park or Englewood. And then I ask, what's the reason for death? And the hands shoot up in the audience, and they say, well, it's homicide. And I say, no, it's heart disease and cancer account for over 60% of the premature mortality, followed by infant mortality, and then homicide and opioid deaths. There are 5 causes of death that account for almost more than 70% of the premature mortality in these neighborhoods in Chicago. And so I think and if you look at the root cause of death gaps, it just didn't happen overnight. These were acts, and they were acts of violence. And I and others call it structural violence. And it's structural because it was designed into the laws and processes of our society, how we police, how we educate, how we house, how we tolerate things that should be tolerated, how we make them normal when they're abnormal, and they're violent because people die prematurely as a result. And it's really important to name the root causes: structural racism, economic exploitation or deprivation. People are working hard in these neighborhoods, but they're not making enough money to live a life that's going to allow them to be healthy. And we know from the medical literature that 80% of life expectancy has to do with the conditions that you work, live, and play in. And as long as we tolerate these kind of conditions, they are going to afflict. It's a form of affliction. So this inequality, these human-made, man-made systems are afflicting people just like it was a virus. So now I'm going to end. I'm going to sort of, before you do, I know you have another question and I could talk forever, but I want to talk about COVID for just a second. Here's a virus. So, and the facts that I just outlined are had been up until recently largely invisible. People didn't say it. People didn't name it. People didn't name root causes of this. Now think about COVID for a second. Here's a virus for which no one in humankind has immunity to. So why does it kill, like everything else, Black people at 6-to-1 rates as white people and Latinos as well? Why does it do that if we're all lack immunity to it? Does it just stick to people? You know what I'm saying? It's like you have to ask yourself, here's a virus, right? We're all supposed to be susceptible for, but how come some people are more susceptible? And it's not the virus itself, it's the inequality or the inequities that we've tolerated. So I call those death gaps. As a doctor, as someone who went into a profession to really heal and save lives, I was shocked to, have to admit that it was the conditions themselves. And that's where the optimism comes in, because the good news is these are not, if it's your biology, you have to change the person, right? If it's your beliefs, I have to convince you in your behaviors as well. But if it's actually the system, then we can get busy fixing the systems. So that was a long-winded answer to your question.
Well, yeah, Dr. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I just want to, again, for those of you guys who are just joining us, having a conversation with Dr. David Ansell, Rush Nearest Medical Center Hospital, and Spencer Jacob, advanced practice provider and one of the elders here at Park Community Church, talking about the death gap and COVID-19. If you're just joining us, just want to remind you too, please go ahead and put any questions you have in the comments. Ask those questions, and we would love to take a stab at answering those questions with Dr. Ansell and with Spencer in just a moment. So, Dr. Ansell, I just want to restate again, just hearing you as you shared that for a moment. I heard you say that when you looked at the statistics and asked folks about the causes of death, and you gave the example of a teenage African-American young man in Garfield Park, and you said that what actually was the cause of death was heart disease and cancer. I think for many of us, that's actually disrupting maybe a narrative that we have in our minds of the cause of death. Could you just clarify that? Is that what I heard correctly? All right. Well, Dr. Ansell's sound is working on his sound. That's okay. But just while he does that, just for those of you who didn't necessarily hear that, as he explained, many of us who live in the city and as a church, Park Community Church, we're a group of people who we believe it's the gospel of Jesus Christ that transforms lives. We believe that with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that we have a call on us as followers of Jesus to love God and to love our neighbors. So that's why we as a church care for this city and what happens in the city, not only in the places where we live and not only in the places where we meet, but also in the places where we are not. And so as we talk about the death gap and the impact on the lives of people throughout the city, I was so grateful that you guys are with us for the conversation. As Dr. Ansell is coming back on, Spencer, you are part of a circulation, which you described as a medical fellowship. And it's my understanding that there's a couple hundred folks that are involved with that. And what was the kind of the motivation for you to get involved with that? And as you shared, you've acted on some of the things that Dr. Ansell has taught, and it's propelled you to work in the in neighborhoods where perhaps those opportunities and the death gap is a real thing. So tell us a little bit about how you got motivated to do that.
Yes, so I actually went through the pastoral residency at Park, and out of that came the medical fellowship. And I think when you look at the world of medicine from the viewpoint of being a Christian. A Christian believes, and a follower of Jesus Christ believes, that every gift and every talent you have is given to you by God. And so the question is, how do you steward that? And that's really the question that drove me with medicine. I felt like God had equipped me to be able to provide care in the world of medicine, but how could I use those skills to really bring glory to the Lord? And that's kind of where the medical fellowship came out of, is to bridge that gap between the world of faith and medicine and really hone in on how providers throughout the city can detach themselves from kind of the typical mindset and the typical world of medicine, but then use it in a way to steward their skills to provide care throughout the world.
That's great. That's great. Well, Dr. Ansell, it's good to have you back. I know that we're working through all of our technical difficulties, but while we're doing that, guys, please do continue to put your questions in the comments that we love to get to those today. So again, Dr. Ansell, what I'd asked for you to clarify was I heard for those of us who are in the city and love the city, love people in this city, for some of us watching and to this tonight, and maybe we're watching it later as we're hearing the replay, we heard you explain that that there's something different about the narrative, that perhaps many of us would assume that a young teenager, African-American man in Garfield Park would die of violence, when yet you said actually the life expectancy is actually impacted by things like heart disease and cancer. Did we hear you correctly when you said that?
Absolutely. And yes, it's true. The number 1 and 2 cause of death are cardiometabolic disease and cancer. And it's about 60% of the premature mortality. And then you add infant mortality on, and then you get homicide and other things. And so it's actually the common diseases that are prematurely killing people. And by the way, one of the way that COVID acts is to select out those people who have those chronic illnesses prematurely, and it's a much worse disease in people who have like obesity and the like. So yes, and so you have to ask yourself. I always like, I've been the best crash test dummy for these sorts of things. Why do everyone in an audience have a knee-jerk reaction that gun violence, is the number 1 cause of death, when we know in every community in America is heart disease? And I think it has to do with our collective mental maps that we hold, of neighborhoods and the people of these neighborhoods. So when I do this and I give a talk and I flash a young black man on a screen, people's minds look at that and say violence. And I think one of the reasons why, there's a lot of reasons why these neighborhoods have been we tolerated allowing these neighborhoods to decline. And it's because we all hold collectively mental maps of good and bad. And then we act unconsciously on those things. That's different than overt racism, and it's different than unconscious bias. But we have actually collectively held maps of what neighborhoods are good and what neighborhoods are bad, and that determines where we spend our money, what we do, where we move our businesses, where you open your doctor's offices, where you open your grocery stores, where you would send your kids to school. And that then perpetuates the original historic injustices. And when you have people who then live, from childhood to adulthood in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, that the stress and all of the accumulated things that occur over a lifetime, those blows are born on the body and prematurely cause heart disease and cancer, and actually stimulate behaviors that are less than ideal behaviors as well. So it's, so it is heart disease and cancer, and it's caused in large part by the concentration of poverty, which is, human made.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, Dr. Ansell, for that. We do have a few questions that folks are putting in, so thank you. We're going to getting to those, and so please continue to put your questions in the chat because we're going to be answering those as we are going through these. So, Censor, I know that there were some questions you wanted to ask Dr. Ansell. Go ahead and please go ahead and do those, please.
Definitely. So, thinking about the COVID-19 situation, would you say that COVID-19 does confirm the arguments for the death gap, or do you feel like there's any difference in it altogether?
No, I think COVID confirms. Just as if you think of epidemics, just an epidemic like this, many epidemics start like this one did. So the Great Plague in Middle Ages started traveling along the Silk Road. And while the merchants who were dealing with silk and spices got sick first, eventually it settled into the neighborhoods of Europe, and 1/3 of Europe died. So just to think about that was the plague, Yersinia pestis. Think about the AIDS epidemic. AIDS in many ways started as a travel epidemic. Someone picked it up. I think case one was an airplane worked for the airlines, and that virus was among people who were highly traveled in the beginning. People moved around, but eventually moved into the neighborhoods. When you think of the things like even the heat wave of Chicago in 1995, the heat affects us all, right? But some people died and some people didn't die. And Katrina as well, like I have a chapter in the Death Gap called Fire and Rain. It talked about how the lessons of the heat wave in Chicago were lost. In other words, that it disproportionately affected Black neighborhoods, the heat wave, just as Katrina disproportionately neighborhoods in New Orleans. This virus has disproportionately affected, and I want to say in two ways. Number one is people who, people who live in Black neighborhoods are more likely to have front-facing, public-facing jobs. America's essential workers. They've only become essential in this epidemic. But they're front-facing, public-facing. They work in nursing homes. Before I got on this call, I was on a call with a pastor friend of mine in Austin, Ira Acree, and members of his church who are in healthcare. They are nursing home workers. They are transporters. Those are public-facing jobs. If you remember that bus driver from Detroit talking about his Facebook page of someone coughing all over him on the bus. He died of COVID 9 days later. So I think there's a higher risk of exposure. And because of the premature heart disease and other diseases, people are more likely to die. So it reveals an epidemic does exactly what a heat wave does, or a Category 5 hurricane does. It reveals the social fault line, the chasms, the social chasms that exist between one neighborhood and the next, and then you get the difficulty with social isolation if you're living in a multi-generational family. So all of these things layered on reveal, as you say, the existing conditions that are there all the time. It's the disaster that's going on day in, day out. So it's just when we have an epidemic disaster or a natural disaster, it's as if all the CNN, cameras now, land and begin to point this the obvious out. But it's been there all the time, and an epidemic just reveals it.
Yeah. So, and Dr. Ansell, thank you for that. As you kind of think about the current situation with COVID-19, and I know we have a number of questions that we're going to get to, but one of the questions that was asked is, can you help us understand this causal relationship between poverty and heart disease? We'd like to just kind of explore that a little bit because you've mentioned this a couple of times, that this death gap and that reality that it plays a role in, the the lower life expectancy for those in these neighborhoods. And these are real people that we care and love, sometimes our own friends and neighbors. So can you help us understand that a little bit more?
Well, the body's a vessel, isn't it? And in a way, and we're not separate from our external environment. And there's been a lot of study that's been done on many, many different levels about the effect of chronic stress on hormonal changes in the body, on the genes themselves. So people, as a professor at University of Michigan, some at University of Washington, won a Nobel Prize once, who've been studying the chromosomes in the body, and the chromosomes have tips called telomeres, and there's something called biological weathering in people who live in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty and are exposed to this through a lifetime have shorter tips of their chromosomes, and that's called biological weathering. So we know that we're not immune from the environments that we live in. Now, you've seen this pretty overtly with a GI who goes over to Afghanistan or Iraq and comes back with PTSD, and then can't function as a result of it. So that's sort of the stress of war. He or she went there, physiologically normal and came back physiologically damaged. Well, imagine what happens day in and day out with that exposure in the neighborhoods. People call it, a continuing traumatic stress disorder, not a post-traumatic stress disorder. And that stuff has not only psychological effects, it has physiological effects that have been well demonstrated. And these things then lead to things like hypertension and premature atherosclerosis. So that's kind of a shortened version of what happens.
That's helpful to understand. I think that for our audience, there's a topic that the Death Gap focuses on: inequality killing. And a few years ago, you gave a TED talk in Chicago, and you kind of discussed the concept behind how inequality killed, and you illustrated the discrepancy with uninsured and organ transplants. And you gave another example of wait lists at Cook County for an eye doctor versus a private eye doctor. Can you touch on this a little bit and kind of walk us through these examples of inequality?
Yeah, so having been a doctor who's in 40 years has worked at 3 hospitals, literally down the street from each other, and reflecting on my experience when I got invited to come to Rush to be its inaugural chief medical officer, and brought all my patients with me. So I understood a couple things in that journey. Number one, there was something, there was something about the neighborhoods themselves and how they've been afflicted. An act of affliction is a verb. It didn't just rain on the west side of Chicago. One didn't wake up one day and the west side of Chicago was like that. The embers of the 1968 fires are still glowing in that neighborhood. These neighborhoods just have not been rebuilt and reinvested in. So there's something about the neighborhood themselves, but then the institutions that are in these neighborhoods that serve them, whether they be schools, whether they be hospitals, clinics, themselves have to take a vow of poverty. So I worked at Mount Sinai for a decade. I was chair of internal medicine at Mount Sinai. Many days we had 3 or 4 days cash on hand out in the capital spends you could do every year. So at a place like Rush or Northwestern or University of Chicago, you need a new MRI machine. You generally can go out and get it. But at a place like Sinai, I remember we kept getting bad grades on our kidney dialysis, and we had some of the smartest kidney doctors in the city of Chicago, And when I asked the head of kidney doctors, why were we getting bad grades on quality? He said, because the machines are so old, they don't clean out people's blood effectively. And we were able that year to get him new machines. But the story I told was about transplant, and so people can understand how inequality kills. So in my almost 30 years at Cook County and Mount Sinai, exactly 0 of my patients who needed a life-saving organ transplant received one. 0 received them. I remember one young man, he was 21, 22, father of 2. I remember he came into the hospital with heart failure. He got a viral heart disease, and his heart wasn't working as well. His 2 brothers sat by his bed till he recovered. We got him home. We got him on medication. He needed a heart transplant. He was uninsured. He was 22. Anywhere else in the world, I mean, he would have gone on a list. I'm not saying it's easy to get a heart transplant, but we couldn't even send him anywhere because he was uninsured. No one would take him, and he died, 21, 22. But what was striking to me is that the organs that went to the transplant recipients at the 5 or 6 transplant centers we have in the region came from the bodies of the black and brown people in the ICUs at Mount Sinai and Cook County. And, as a doctor, that's not fair. That's not just. And it was almost as if the things that we needed were just out of reach. And there's no reason that healthcare. So it's one thing to. So we've afflicted these neighborhoods again with concentrated poverty, which is bad for anyone. I don't care, white, black, or otherwise. It's just disproportionately black people compared to white people, say in the city of Chicago, across the country, living in concentrated poverty. It's one thing to afflict people with that, other than when they go to the healthcare institutions, not have the same access to care. That's a problem during COVID. The tests, like if, I'm very proud of Rush. Rush built out a really, fantastic response to COVID, and even has a COVID clinic. There's a free app. You can go on if you have COVID symptoms. You can call Rush and you can see someone for free. There's no charge for it. And if you need to get tested, you can get tested. But that's not convenient for everybody. And in Austin or in Garfield Park, you can't get tested. In the Latino neighborhoods of the city, you can't get tested. That's just unacceptable. And as a doctor, I was outraged by this. See, I felt like I was a little bit duped. I thought if people like me just showed up in the neighborhoods and did the work at a community health center, that we could make it better. And I want to say, yes, we can make it better. Don't get me wrong. But to have this deck stacked so much against the people in these neighborhoods simply because they're poor and simply because they're black and Latino is just an unacceptable proposition. And it really outraged me. I think that's why I wrote the book. Actually, I wrote those 2 books while I was chief medical officer at Rush, because I was so shocked by the facts. And I'll tell the second story about the chief medical officer of Cook County at the time. And I don't think this is true now, but he came over to me and said, David, the wait list for the eye clinic at Cook County, I'm at Rush now, is so long that people can go blind waiting. And at Rush, you could literally get in that day or the next day to see the eye doctors across the street. Who designs a world like this? So as a doctor, I just found it really unacceptable. And I still find it unacceptable in this. But I think there's also reason for hope. And we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ansell, one of the questions that perhaps folks are, when they hear words in terms like poverty, or we kind of hear these conversations, oftentimes there's sort of a pivot to a mental map of, well, it's just because there's a poor diet in that context, or other things. But is there sort of a poverty, an effect of the health? Is that related to increased stress that happens on a daily basis? Or is there a hereditary factor that plays a role in sort of the health and well-being in concentrated places like this, or is it sort of a combination of all of those things? And thank you, Ruth, for
Well, listen, yes, it's a great it's a great question, right? And obviously every disease is biological, right? It changes. A disease in the body by definition is biological, right? But it would be an exaggeration to say that a large part of the death gap is biological or genetic. And if you think about it for a second, you'd have to argue that people with genetic predisposition to every disease in the world that we know have moved into these neighborhoods. And that's not true, right? Right? I mean, it's not plausible. It's simply, we had this argument with breast cancer. I got to tell you, but it took me about 30 years as a white man to say the words racism.
Hmm.
And to name it racism. And I think racism has been, it's just been a poison on our society and our health, because what we've done is we've conflated skin color and race and ethnicity as being biological determinants, when genetically, we're 99.7 or 8% similar. So biology works biological. They're not to say they're not genetic diseases or genetic predisposition, but this is social conditions that are largely driving this. Now, let me make a point for people who may not believe this. So in Chicago, there are plenty of poor white people, but there's not one poor white neighborhood. Now, maybe after COVID there will be, but I'm saying there's just not. And generally around the country, because of social mobility, white people, even poor white people, have more ability to move to neighborhoods that have less concentrated poverty. And that means that young girl who grows up in that neighborhood has the opportunity to touch many things. And if you grow up in the north side of Chicago and you're poor, you're still poor and you're going to suffer from the effects of poverty. But you're going to have other things around you that are going to make a difference. Social mobility is critical. And this is something that we've lost in American society. When you don't have social mobility, poor health follows. And if you see, it's easy if I say, well, gosh, you're genetically, it's your genes. Everyone in my family has hypertension. It must be genetic. Well, maybe everyone in your family's been subject to, years of one form of oppression or another. And that's happened. Not to say you can't modify things in your life, you can. But it's really important to make that distinction, because if it's biological, if it's genetic, then I must spend all of my time fixing you. And if it's social, then we've got, or structural, then I've got to spend at least part of my time fixing those structural pieces.
That's helpful to understand. We did get another question from Sarah. Why do you think Chicago is seeing higher COVID-19 death rates for communities of color compared to other cities and communities in the U.S.?
Because we're among the most racist, segregated cities in the country. Now, when I say racist, I'm not talking just overt race. I'm talking about this mental map thing, which I think is the most heinous kind of racism. Because overt anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, you can at least respond to or walk away from. Unconscious bias we can be trained out of, right? You can really do the work once we get to know each other. Things fall to the wayside that we might have been biased. But it's these mental maps that we collectively held. For whatever reason, Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the country, and public policy over generations and decades have perpetuated conditions that have led to a larger black-white social and economic and biological outcomes than other places in the country. So let me just lay it all out to you. People have looked at the cost of segregation. This is the Metropolitan Planning Council. Cost of segregation in Chicago. If Chicago was just averagely segregated in the United States, what would be the economic impact? I want to say it was $2 to $4 billion a year, and lost revenue dollars in Chicago just because we have so many poor neighborhoods and that they're largely black. The city has lost population. We lose money as a city just by not being average. But in life expectancy, in the United States as a whole, the life expectancy gap between white America and black America is 4 years. That's bad. In Chicago, it's 9 years. So Chicago is worse. And by the way, if you complain about our national government right now and our leader right now, which you may be one of those people who watches TV and curses the TV. This has all been under Democrats in Chicago, And I got to tell you, Mayor Lori Lightfoot is the first one in my whole. Harold Washington, no, I won't say. Harold Washington got it. But he was up against the fight of his life when he got into power. But Mayor Lightfoot gets it. I'm not saying these problems are easy to solve, but you have to start with a common understanding that these gaps are caused by inequality. Yeah, food is important, but if you don't have a grocery store, if you can't afford the food, you're going to eat crummy food, and that's going to affect your health. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify this. But we have something much worse going on in Chicago than other places. Though I have to say, these numbers like COVID mortality are from across the country.
Do you feel like these death gaps are across the U.S. and internationally?
Yes, they are. Wherever there is a social hierarchy, the people on the top do better, and the people on the bottom do worse. And that's true if you're a Rohingya in Burma, or whether you're a black person or Native American in the United States. So there's, first of all, poverty kills, and life expectancy of the poor is much lower than life expectancy of the rich. Here's the point of it: it's not inevitable. And there are places in the world that have really focused on this, which have seen narrowing of the gaps between the wealthy and the poor. What we've seen in the United States is a growing gaps between the rich and the poor in general, and life expectancy over time. It had been narrowing, and in many ways, the country up until recently has been doing well with life expectancy, but the gap between the rich and the poor is widening. By the way, in the last few years, we saw a rise in white mortality. So premature mortality among white people, when it was occurring, and we saw this, that life expectancy dropped in the United States as a whole, something that hasn't been seen almost anywhere in the world. Here, with all this money in healthcare we're spending, life expectancy was dropping, largely because white people began to experience the same life expectancy problems that black people had been experiencing for decades.
Wow. Dr. Ansell, a question that perhaps would give us some question of pause is like, one, just can you just say to us again what the actual, to your knowledge, the statistics are on COVID-19 and the numbers on how it's affecting the percentages of people in Chicago, particularly? We've heard numbers that African Americans are dying at a higher rate. What are those numbers? And then as we think about that particular question, when we are discussing this with our coworkers or we're having conversations with people in our circle of relationships who maybe are skeptical about some of these systemic issues you described, like how would you explain those those things sort of in numbers and details and data, and to help someone to see what's there, because the things you're talking about is you're suggesting that they've always been there, sort of hiding in plain sight.
Yeah. Well, I think the data is important, and be able to show the data. I don't know the most recent data, but when this first came out about Black mortality, it's on the Chicago Department of Health website, so people can go look it up. You know, there were, I think, about 118 or so Black deaths at the time, and about 30 white deaths. So that was the shocking, initial number that got people thinking about it. But if you looked at the rates of the diseases, actually the disease, people catching the disease, more people were catching COVID on the west and the south sides of the city than on the north side, even though this is a virus that can attack everyone. I think if we, how do you get people to see this? I think we got to talk about it. You got to show the data. I got to give the mayor a lot of credit. She created a rapid response, racial health equity task force. I'm on it. Others around the city are on it to really say, what can we do to make a difference? If you don't, the idea here is not just to point out the gaps, but to do something about it. And that's where the optimism comes in, because this is actually not, the work itself is not that difficult if you have the will, but it requires, I say, three forms of capital. Number one, human capital. We need to be in these neighborhoods in every which way we can, supporting people. First of all, our frontline workers, many of them are coming from these neighborhoods. We're taking care of our patients in our hospitals and our nursing homes and such. So we got to put our own human capital in these neighborhoods. We have to go to these neighborhoods. We have to spend our money. We have to support businesses in these neighborhoods. We have to push for public policy that aim to fairness. And the second thing is, social capital, which we have, the church has, the idea that we're stronger. A famous rabbi said, when if two people get together, a third person should benefit. And when you get together, so how do we leverage our organizations to actually engage more deeply in these neighborhoods, not just food drives and things like that, but what are the ways we can leverage our social capital in these neighborhoods? And the third thing is capital itself. These neighborhoods, if you want to look at the root cause, is capital has been removed out of these neighborhoods. These were heavily capitalized neighborhoods that became decapitalized, or people say disinvested. That sounds too easy a word, but became decapitalized. And we have to get capital neighborhoods, capital to build housing, capital to build schools, capital to get our businesses to move in there. And other things like that, because when people have good jobs and they have an opportunity at education, health will follow. So, but I think we've ignored it far too long, far to our peril. Because to think that COVID is not going to jump Austin Avenue and go from Austin to Oak Park and River Forest, or not go down the blue line to the lakefront, is a naive misconception.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think about kind of one of the questions that Kelly asked, and thank you. Kind of started to answer that. Now that we know what the death gap is, how do we as a city and community take actionable steps to assist in narrowing these gaps? And appreciated how you mentioned human capital, actually being present and being engaged in neighborhoods where these gaps exist. And so grateful that we have a number of folks who are doing that. Love how Together Chicago, for example, Renew Chicago, Chicago Delivers are on point, all those engaging with those neighborhoods. But I also love that you talk about social capital, and as a church. And now as a church, we unapologetically proclaim a gospel. We trust in Jesus as our Lord and Savior. And we know that there's people maybe watching who don't share that same conviction, but we know there's people of faith watching and they're joining us tonight. But one of the things that even as we have Sensor on tonight, Sensor, I know that part of your journey has been that you used to work at Rush, and then you are at working in an organization that you're actually providing help in one of these neighborhoods, some of the neighborhoods where the death gaps exist, and you started Circulation with now 200 folks in there. So, Sensor, maybe what would you encourage folks to do and how they can get involved with Circulation so that they can start being part of the human capital solution and the social capital solution?
Definitely. So I think that, when you think about these areas, the biggest question is what motivates you. And I think for me, it's Jesus Christ and wanting to really go where the need is, and kind of what the concept of the death cap, go into these communities that need help and need service. And so the advantage of Circulation is that we provide opportunities to get involved with those neighborhoods and to go across the globe. So it's not just constrained to Chicago, but there's opportunities in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, where you can go and serve and be used and hopefully bring glory to the Lord, unapologetically. That's kind of, the mindset behind it. And so I would strongly encourage those who are considering, what their motivation is, and when exploring the concept of the death gap and how to get more involved, that they look for those opportunities. And if they want to be a part of Circulation, there's going to be information at the end of this session on how to reach out to us so that we can get them plugged in. But our church has a platform for opportunities within the city and within across the nations and the globe.
That's great. Well, man, it's been such a great conversation, and I hope that it's stimulated you as you're watching now to be thinking how you can be more active and engaged with this issue. I just want to say a special thank you, Dr. Ansell. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for taking time out of your day to be with us, and certainly grateful for all the great work that you're doing here in our city. While we have different roles in our city, that your work represents and demonstrates a care for the people of Chicago. And so we're grateful that you've chosen to be with us and shared your insights tonight. Also, just want to thank you, Sensor, for being with us and continuing as not only leading in our church, but also as you lead by example, as you engage in the great work of taking the love of Jesus through your work that you do in the neighborhoods of the city. So thank you guys for being here tonight. And I just want to say you're so welcome. And for those of you who are watching, just want to remind you that if you want to learn more, one of the best things you can do is just get a copy of that book, The Death Gap, Dr. Ansell's book, and encourage you to grab that and read through that and be prepared to learn as we think about how we best love and serve the people here in our city. I also want to encourage you that, as many of you asked, what are some steps we can take? Well, one practical step you can take is to donate, be part of assisting folks that are in need in the midst of this crisis in the city here and now. And Renew Chicago is a great organization to be part of. They are engaged as a organization to love and show the care for others in the context of our city, and they're directly connected to partners and ministries all throughout this city. And 100% of the money that's given to Renew Chicago will now be going out to addressing the pandemic. So if you want to give to a place, Renew Chicago would be a great place to do that. Also, want to encourage you that one of the best things you can do is serve. And many of us, depending on how this crisis has impacted you, some of you are busier now with your work and balancing all of your responsibilities, and others you might have some more free time. And whether it's from your living room or whether it's outside your door, there's a couple ways that you can get involved. The first way that you can get involved to provide immediate relief for a very clear and visible need in our city is Chicago Delivers. Chicago Delivers. And it was started by some church planters and pastor friends of ours to get food to those who are under-resourced, especially the elderly, many of whom have had to go out to get groceries, which would be a life and death decision, as we've talked about in these many of the neighborhoods that are impacted by the death gap. And so Chicago Delivers is a great space and place for you to go to ensure that people get fed, and then also to provide comfort and emotional support. So go to chicagodelivers.org. That's a very practical step and thing you can be a part of. The other way that you can get involved and take a step as we address the death gap is work for structural change in our city. That folks on the south and west sides have equal opportunities and some of the same footing as other Chicago neighborhoods. Frankly, for those of us like me, if you live in Chicago for any number of time and you pay attention to the data, you'll know that there's neighborhoods where opportunities are simply at a disadvantage than other neighborhoods. And so one of the ways you can get involved with that is through Together Chicago, and they work to provide equity in educational, legal, housing, and economic outcomes here in the city. And in fact, a number of the folks with Together Chicago have actually worked with Dr. Ansell's colleagues at Rush and at Lawndale and Garfield Park and in Austin to make a positive impact on our city. And there's broad solutions, holistic solutions that everyone in our city can use their God-given talents to make a difference. Well, I just want to address for those of us who are watching who are followers of Jesus. And I do want to just say that if you're watching this live or if you're watching a replay and perhaps you're in healthcare and maybe you don't share the same faith convictions that those of us who are followers of Jesus do, I'm so glad you're here. But I do want to address those of us who name the name of Jesus, those of us who call ourselves Christians. You know, tonight we've heard really challenging data and statistics about our city, the city in which we love and care for the people who are in it. And I just want to read something to you from Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7. It says, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord and on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find welfare." Now, I want to particularly focus on that word welfare, shalom, the peace of God, the goodness of God, the city for the city. As followers of Jesus, we have been given peace with God. And that's not just peace in absence of conflict. We've been given wholeness in our relationship with him through what Jesus has done for us. And the clarion call on us is that we love God with all of our heart, soul, and strength. And as Jesus said, to love our neighbors ourselves, that the outpouring of our relationship and peace with God is that we can then go to others who are in need and offer that to them. And that shows up in our deeds, our actions, our words. And I want to encourage those of us who are followers of Jesus that we wouldn't ignore what we've heard tonight. We'd share this broadcast with others, and ask what your role might be in addressing the death gap, because we, as followers of Jesus, we have been given the opportunity and the privilege to love those that he's placed us in this city to serve. With that, I'd love to close our time in prayer, and if you would be so kind to join us again. If you're not a person of faith, that's okay, but I'd love to close this time in prayer. Father God, thank you for this evening. Thank you for those who have been watching now and those who are viewing this even now. Thank you for the opportunity to be challenged with the reality of need in our city and our opportunity to speak up and to speak out and to take action as you would see fit. May you motivate us, and may your spirit empower us. May we boldly take steps to proclaim the good news in the words we say and the actions we take. And in it all, may Jesus get glory. Because at the end of the day, Lord, we want folks to experience the life-giving, life-transforming work of the good news of the gospel of Jesus. We pray these things in his name. Amen. Folks, thank you for joining us tonight. We are so grateful that you're with us, and may God bless you as you go on from here. Share this with someone, and we look forward to seeing this death gap in Chicago close by God's power. Go in peace. Thank you.